I can still feel the sting on my cheek even now. Not because the pain lasted, but because the moment did. My daughter-in-law's hand came out of nowhere, and before I could even breathe, the words followed like venom. "You're useless to us. Go rot in the slums." I stood there, my shopping bag slipping from my hand, the apples rolling across the kitchen floor. My son, my own son, was standing right behind her, leaning on the counter, and he didn't say a single word. Not one. His eyes flickered toward mine for a second, but they didn't hold any warmth. They just slid away. It's strange how time slows down in moments like that. I noticed the smell of the stew burning on the stove. I noticed a small tear in the curtain by the sink. I noticed my own hands trembling not from fear, but from disbelief. She turned away, as if nothing had happened, muttering something about having more important things to deal with. My son cleared his throat and followed her into the living room, their voices dropping to a low murmur I couldn't make out. I didn't cry. Not then. I just bent down, slowly picked up the apples one by one, and placed them back in the bag. My cheek was hot, but my chest felt cold. The house that I had opened to them, the home that had once been filled with laughter, suddenly felt like it belonged to strangers. And the strangest part, I didn't feel shocked at her words. Deep down, I think I'd been bracing for them for months. Let me know where you're listening from. I always love seeing how far these stories travel. And if this story speaks to you, share your thoughts below. Don't skip, because what happens at the end will surprise you more than the betrayal itself. I suppose you need to understand how I ended up in that kitchen, holding a bag of apples like a shield with my son's wife, looking at me as if I was nothing more than an old burden. The truth is, I had loved them both. I had cooked for them, babysat their little boy, and covered more than one of their overdue bills without a word. I had been the kind of mother-in-law I thought every young couple would be lucky to have: patient, respectful, not meddling, but always there when needed. I never imagined that one day my kindness would be taken as weakness. It hadn't always been like this. When they first moved in with me temporarily, they'd said it felt almost like the old days when my son was small. He'd bring me tea in the evenings, we'd watch the news together, and his wife would join me in the kitchen chatting while we chopped vegetables. But slowly, things changed. She started making small comments about how crowded the house felt, then about how I took up space in the living room. I brushed it off, thinking she was just adjusting. My son, instead of reassuring me, began spending more time out, coming home late, avoiding conversation. The first real sign that something was wrong came a few weeks before the slap. I'd gone to the cupboard to get my tea tin and found it empty. I could have sworn I'd just bought a new one. When I asked her, she shrugged and said we needed the space. She'd thrown it out, not misplaced it, not set it aside, just decided it was no longer needed. And that was how it began, the quiet removal of my things. A picture frame here, a cushion there, as if she was erasing my presence one object at a time. That day in the kitchen was supposed to be ordinary. I'd gone to the market early picking up apples because my grandson loves them. I thought I'd bake a pie. My hands were still cold from the morning air when I came in, and I could hear them talking in the living room. I didn't catch the words, but I caught the tone, sharp, tense. I remember thinking I should stay quiet, keep to myself. Then she appeared, blocking the doorway, her face set in a glare I didn't understand. I asked if something was wrong. That's when it happened. The sound of the slap echoed in my head, but her words cut deeper. "You're useless to us, go rot in the slums." It was the U.S. that pierced me most. She had claimed my son as hers completely, and I had been pushed out not just from the kitchen, but from his life. I wish I could say I screamed back, or that I walked out right then. But I didn't. I stood there frozen because the betrayal didn't come from her hand. It came from his silence. That was the moment something inside me shifted. I didn't know exactly what I'd do, but I knew this. I would never let myself be cornered like this again. When they left the room, I stayed where I was for a long time. The stew on the stove burned to the bottom of the pot, filling the kitchen with a bitter smell. I poured it down the sink, washed the pot, and put the apples away. My movements were slow, deliberate, as if I was trying to anchor myself in something normal. But inside, I was already rewriting the story of my life. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about every time I'd chosen to be quiet to keep the peace. Every time I'd stepped aside so my son could make his own choices. Every time I'd told myself that family loyalty meant swallowing my own hurt. That night, I decided that loyalty wasn't the same as self-sacrifice, and that some betrayals can't be forgiven in the way people expect. The next morning, I woke up before the sun and made myself a cup of tea from the emergency stash I kept hidden in the laundry room. I sat at the table staring out the window at the frost on the garden. I didn't know yet how things would end, but I knew I'd stopped being afraid. And once a person stops being afraid, they become someone others shouldn't underestimate. That was the day everything truly began. Before you judge me for what I eventually did, you need to understand where I came from the years before that slap, before those words burned themselves into my memory. My life wasn't always about loss or betrayal. There was a time when my days were filled with love and my heart was light. I raised my son alone. His father left when he was 6, disappearing without a trace, except for a single letter that smelled faintly of cologne and regret. I never remarried. Not because I didn't have offers, I did, but because my boy needed stability and I promised myself I would be enough. We didn't have much, but we had each other, and that felt like everything. I worked double shifts at the factory, then came home to make dinner, help with homework, and tell him bedtime stories until he fell asleep. I remember his small hand in mine when we walked to school, the way he'd squeeze it 3 times our little code for, "I love you." He was a good child. Thoughtful, protective. Even when money was tight, he never complained. On the rare weekends I wasn't working, we'd sit on the couch with a blanket, watching old movies and eating popcorn I'd popped on the stove. He used to tell me, "One day, I'll buy you a house with a big garden, Mom." I never needed the house. I just needed that promise. When he graduated and got his first job, I was so proud I could have burst. He took me out to dinner at a little Italian place and insisted on paying the bill. "You've done enough for me, Mom," he said, smiling. Now it's my turn. I believed him. I believed every word. I met his future wife at a family barbecue. She was beautiful, big brown eyes, glossy hair, the kind of presence that fills a room. She was polite at first, calling me Mrs. Tran, even when I told her to call me by my first name. I liked her. I liked the way she made my son laugh, the way she seemed genuinely interested in my stories about when he was young. When they got engaged, I welcomed her into the family without hesitation. I even offered to help with the wedding costs. She declined, or rather she smiled sweetly and said, "We'll manage." That should have been my first hint. Not because she refused, but because of the way her eyes flicked toward my son before answering, as if she needed his approval first. The wedding was beautiful. I cried, of course. My son looked so happy standing there, holding her hands, promising forever. I told myself she would be good for him, that she would take care of him the way I had. I never thought about whether she would take care of me too. They rented a small apartment at first, but when their son, my grandson, was born, space became tight. They started visiting more often, staying for dinner, sometimes, even spending the night. I didn't mind. I loved having the baby around, loved rocking him to sleep, and feeling his tiny fingers wrap around mine. When they asked if they could move in just until we save for a bigger place, I said yes before they even finished the sentence. I cleared out my sewing room so they could have more space. I rearranged the kitchen so it would be easier for her to cook. I thought it was temporary. In those first months, it felt almost like a dream. I would come home from the market and find her humming to the baby while my son worked on his laptop at the kitchen table. We'd eat together, share chores, and in the evenings we'd watch TV, the baby sleeping between us. She even started calling me Mom, and I didn't realize how much I missed hearing that word until she said it. But the cracks came slowly. She began to correct the way I held the baby. Then she told me I was too old-fashioned in the way I cooked. At first I laughed it off. She was young, she had her ways. But then she started making decisions about the house without asking me. Changing the furniture layout. Replacing my dishes with her own. My son, instead of mediating, stayed silent. I told myself it wasn't worth making a fuss over. After all, they were family. The real shift happened one evening when I overheard them talking in their room. I was walking past with a load of laundry when I caught her saying, "She's holding us back." My son didn't argue. He just said, "We'll figure it out." I stood there in the hallway, my heart pounding, realizing for the first time that maybe my place in their lives wasn't as secure as I'd thought. Still, I tried. I made their favorite meals, looked after the baby whenever they needed, even dipped into my savings to help with their car repairs. I didn't expect gratitude, but I never expected contempt. Every choice I made was for them, because that's what family does. Looking back, I think that's why the slap hurt so much, not just because it was violence, but because it was the final confirmation of something I had been too stubborn to admit. The love and sacrifices I had given them meant nothing to her. And maybe, just maybe, not as much as I thought to him either. I used to believe that family was unbreakable, that love could survive misunderstandings and rough patches. But I learned that trust, once cracked, spreads like a fracture in glass. You can pretend it's fine for a while, but eventually it shatters. What I didn't know then, as I sat in the kitchen the night after the slap replaying the years in my mind, was that those memories would become my fuel. They would remind me of everything I'd given, and they would justify what I was about to take back. It didn't happen all at once. Betrayal rarely does. It seeps in quietly, like water finding its way through the tiniest crack in a wall, until one day you realize the whole thing's rotted from the inside. That's how it was with them, my son and his wife. At first, the changes were small enough to excuse. My son stopped joining me for our evening tea. I told myself he was busy with work. She stopped eating my cooking, saying she was watching her diet, but I'd see the takeaway containers in the trash. The conversations got shorter, the smiles tighter. I started feeling like a guest in my own home. I remember one Sunday afternoon, I was folding laundry in the living room when my grandson toddled over to me with his arms out. I lifted him onto my lap, and we were giggling over a silly face I made when she walked in. She didn't smile. She just stood there, watching us for a moment, then said, "He's too used to you. He needs to bond with me." She took him without waiting for me to hand him over her fingers, brushing mine in a way that felt sharp. My son said nothing, just kept scrolling on his phone. It was around then that I started noticing money going missing from my wallet. Not much, just small amounts. Enough to make me second-guess myself. I'd count it twice before putting it away, and somehow there would still be less the next day. When I brought it up casually, she laughed and said, "Maybe you spent it and forgot. You're not as young as you used to be." My son laughed with her. That stung more than the missing bills. Then came the accidental exclusions. They went to dinner at a new restaurant without telling me, even though we'd always tried places together. They visited friends I'd known for years but didn't invite me along. They went to a community event I loved and told me afterward, "We didn't think you'd be interested." Each time I swallowed it down, telling myself not to make it a bigger deal than it was. But the truth, I was starting to see the pattern. She was pushing me out, slowly, deliberately. And my son, he was letting it happen. One evening, I overheard a phone call she was having in the kitchen while I was in the hall. She was speaking in a low voice, but the words carried. "Once she's gone, we can finally do what we want with the house." My stomach turned. The house. My house. The place I'd bought with decades of hard work. I stood there gripping the doorframe, listening to her pause, then laugh softly before hanging up. I didn't confront her. Not then. I wasn't ready. I needed to be sure of what I was dealing with. So I began to pay closer attention. I noticed that my mail started arriving opened, that some of my jewelry was misplaced for days before mysteriously reappearing. I overheard them arguing about money more than once, her accusing him of not doing enough, him telling her to just wait. And I began to see something in her eyes whenever she looked at me, not irritation, not even dislike. It was calculation, like she was already writing the story of my removal in her head. The final confirmation came one evening when my son was out. She came into the living room, sat across from me, and said almost casually, "Have you ever thought about moving somewhere smaller? Somewhere more suited to your needs?" I looked at her for a long moment before answering. "This house suits me just fine." Her smile didn't reach her eyes. "It's just, you know, big houses are a lot to manage at your age. At your age." She said it like it was a flaw, like I was a fragile object she was being forced to deal with. I didn't rise to it. I just said, "I'm stronger than you think." Her smile slipped for just a second before she stood up and left the room. But I'd seen it. The crack. From that night on, I stopped trying to win her over. I stopped explaining myself, stopped defending my choices. And while she might have thought my silence meant surrender, I knew it was the opposite. Because silence gives you space to think. And I was starting to think about what would happen if I wasn't the one pushed out. If instead, I was the one holding the door open for them to leave. There's a strange kind of freedom that comes with deciding not to fight, at least not in the way they expect. Up until then, every slight, every insult, every quiet attempt to erase me had been met with either an awkward laugh or a small defense. I'd speak up just enough to show I noticed, but never enough to start a war. That changed after the night she suggested I move out. I didn't tell her off. I didn't storm into my son's room demanding he defend me. I just went quiet, not sulking, quiet, observing quiet. The kind of quiet that lets you see the things you've been too busy reacting to notice. At breakfast, I noticed how she always served herself first, even before the baby. How my son had started drinking coffee from the expensive set I'd been saving for special occasions without asking. How she kept her phone angled away from both of us, her thumbs moving quickly whenever a message came in. I started paying attention to their schedules. When they left for errands, when they returned, how long they stayed out. I noticed they always came back with bags, but rarely with anything for the baby. Most of it seemed for themselves: clothes, gadgets, bottles of wine. I watched how my son looked at her when she spoke. There was no softness anymore, just compliance. Like he'd already learned it was easier to agree than to push back. I wondered if he even realized how much of himself he'd given away. One afternoon, while they were out, I went into the kitchen to clean the counters and saw a receipt half buried under a pile of takeout menus. It was for a real estate agency in town. My heart gave a sharp jolt. I picked it up, reading the date just 2 days earlier. The agent's name was printed at the bottom. No details about the property, but I didn't need them. I knew exactly what this meant. They weren't just talking about getting me out of the house, they were actively working on it. That's when my silence became strategy. I started locking certain drawers, the ones with important documents, bank statements, my will. I moved my jewelry into a small safe I kept in the back of my wardrobe. I didn't hide the fact that I was doing it. I wanted them to see. I wanted them to wonder what I was thinking. I also began keeping a small notebook in my bedroom recording every strange thing that happened. Dates, times, conversations, missing items. The look on her face when I refused to hand over the spare key to the storage shed. I even noted when my son seemed uncomfortable or when they fought behind closed doors. The thing about people like her is that they underestimate you when you stop speaking. She seemed to think my silence meant I was defeated, but it only made her bolder and easier to read. She started making more direct comments. You know, some people your age really enjoy retirement communities. Big houses are just too much when you're alone. You could sell this place and live comfortably for years, always with that little sugar coating of fake concern. I responded with polite nods. Sometimes I'd even smile. But inside, I was building something. Not just a plan, a shield. I also started calling people I hadn't spoken to in a while. Old friends, former co-workers, my cousin in Montreal. I didn't spill everything, but I let them know I'd been thinking about updating my legal affairs. You'd be surprised how quickly news like that travels in small circles. I wanted it to reach the right ears, and eventually it would. The moment I knew I had the upper hand came about a month after I found that real estate receipt. They came home one afternoon, whispering urgently in the hallway. I stayed in the kitchen, pretending to wipe the counters. She stepped in, clearly not expecting me to be there. For the briefest second, her face froze, not angry, not smug, but unsettled. It was the first time I'd seen her unsure. That's when I realized she didn't actually know what I was doing. And people fear what they can't see. So I let her stew in it. I became the calm, polite, almost invisible presence in the house. But all the while, I was watching, counting, remembering, waiting for the exact moment when my silence would break not with shouting, but with precision. By then, I had stopped asking myself why my son stayed silent. I already knew the answer. Whatever hold she had over him, it was strong. But I also knew something else in the end. Blood, or not loyalty, is proven in actions, not words. And when the time came, I was ready to show them both exactly who they were dealing with. People often mistake patience for weakness. They think if you're not reacting, you're surrendering. That's what my daughter-in-law thought when I went quiet. She had no idea that every nod, every polite smile, was another brick in the wall I was building between them and everything they thought they could take from me. I didn't just sit in my room and sulk. I began moving pieces slowly, quietly, the way you shift furniture in the night so no one notices until they bump into it. My first step was to meet with my lawyer, an old friend of my late brother. I told them I wanted to review my will, my property deeds, and my financial accounts. We met in the back room of a small cafe on the other side of town, nowhere my son or his wife would ever think to look. I transferred ownership of certain assets into a private trust, the cottage by the lake, a modest sum in bonds, even a small plot of land I'd inherited from my parents. Those were now untouchable by anyone but me and the trustees I named. I also updated my will to reflect some new beneficiaries' friends, a local charity, and my grandson, but under conditions his parents couldn't manipulate. Every time I took a step, I recorded it in my little notebook alongside the things they were doing. By now, the pages were full, the snide comments, the missing belongings, the accidental opening of my mail. It wasn't just for me. I knew one day I might need that notebook as proof, not in a shouting match, but in a place where evidence mattered. I also started removing my valuables from the house one at a time. A pearl necklace went to my cousin for safekeeping. Old photographs and letters went to a friend in another city. A few envelopes of cash went into a safety deposit box. The drawers and shelves in my bedroom began to look emptier, but no one seemed to notice. Meanwhile, I played the role they expected, the quiet, aging woman they could brush aside. She grew more confident, more careless. I overheard her talking to someone on the phone, bragging that it's only a matter of time before the house was theirs. She laughed, a sharp little sound that stayed with me long after the call ended. But my plan wasn't just about protecting myself. It was about timing. I didn't want them just to fail. I wanted them to realize in real time that the ground had been shifting under their feet for months. One Sunday morning, I offered to watch my grandson while they went out. They agreed easily, almost too easily. I suspected they had another meeting with that real estate agent. While they were gone, I went into their room not to snoop, but to confirm. On the desk, under a pile of magazines, I found a folder. Inside were printed property listings notes in her handwriting and a sheet with my address at the top, marked with figures I recognized as estimates for a sale. I didn't take it. I didn't need to. I already had more than enough to connect the dots. That afternoon, when they returned, I was sitting on the porch with my grandson, rocking him gently. She smiled as she passed me, but it was a smile that didn't touch her eyes. I met her gaze for just a second, long enough for her to see that I knew something she didn't. She looked away first. The next week, I made another quiet move. I contacted a trusted realtor, not to sell, but to get a formal valuation of the house in my name only. Once I had that document, I locked it away. Then I filed a no sale without owner consent notice with the municipal records office. It meant that even if they tried to forge papers, no transfer could happen without my signature in person. By this point, my son barely spoke to me, unless it was about the baby. He didn't ask where I went during the day, and she never questioned it either. That was their mistake. They thought ignoring me meant I had no influence left. One evening, as I was making tea, I heard them arguing in their room. She was upset about delays and missing chances, and he was telling her to be patient. For the first time in months, I smiled a real smile. They were starting to feel the frustration I had been nursing for so long. And I wasn't finished. The truth is, I had no intention of just protecting what was mine. I wanted them to know that every move they had made against me had been seen, remembered, and answered. I wanted them to learn the one lesson they had clearly never understood. The quiet ones are the most dangerous. The first real cracks in their armor appeared on a Thursday evening, just as the air was starting to cool with the turn of the season. I was in the kitchen peeling carrots for stew when I heard the front door slam harder than usual. My son's voice came first low and tight. "Why did you say that to him?" Then hers sharper, defensive, because he needed to hear it. I didn't move. I just kept peeling. Their footsteps moved to the living room, and though they tried to keep their voices down, the words carried. They were arguing about a mutual friend who'd confronted them over something I couldn't quite catch what, but I heard enough to know this someone outside the house was starting to see them for what they were. It was only a day later that I found the evidence of another slip. She had left her phone on the counter while running upstairs to grab the baby's bottle. A message popped up from an unfamiliar name. Still no papers signed. "What's taking so long?" I didn't touch the phone, but I memorized the name and number. Later, I looked it up on my own device. Real estate agent. Same office as the receipt I'd found weeks before. Her mistakes became more frequent after that. She sent an email meant for him to my printer, instead a list of urgent things to do before the house situation could be finalized. She also started making calls in the backyard, pacing near the fence, not realizing her voice carried straight into the open kitchen window. I'd catch phrases like, "She won't budge," and "We might have to push harder." I noticed changes in my son, too. He was quieter around her, less willing to meet her eyes when she spoke sharply to him. Once I passed by their door and heard her snapping at him for not being on her side enough. His reply was almost too soft to hear. "This isn't as simple as you think." That night, he came into the kitchen while I was making tea and asked if I was doing okay. It was a clumsy attempt at connection, and I gave him the same polite answer I'd been giving for months. I wasn't ready to show my hand. The shift became obvious at a family gathering. I'd been invited almost as an afterthought to my cousin's birthday dinner. They came too, but I could feel the tension before we even sat down. She tried to dominate the conversation, bragging about future plans, but a few relatives began asking pointed questions about jobs, money, living arrangements. I didn't say a word. I just watched her smile tighten. Watched my son glance toward me as if to check whether I was enjoying the show. Later that night, I got a call from my cousin. She said she'd heard rumors about the way I was being treated. I didn't confirm or deny anything. I simply said, "I'm fine." That's the beauty of silence. People fill it with their own conclusions. And sometimes those conclusions spread faster than any story you could tell. A week after that, I walked into the kitchen to find her on the phone, clearly upset. She didn't see me at first. "No, we can't proceed," she was saying. "Her name's still on everything. I told you we'd sort it by now." When she turned and saw me, her expression froze for just a heartbeat before she forced a smile. "Oh, I was just talking to a friend," she said. I nodded, and for the first time she looked unsure. It was working. The longer I stayed quiet, the more she revealed without realizing. Then came the moment that told me the unraveling had truly begun. One rainy afternoon, I opened the mailbox and found an envelope addressed to me from the same real estate office. Inside was a copy of a letter meant for them outlining that no sale could proceed without my explicit consent. I'd filed that restriction myself, but clearly the office had decided to make it official for all parties involved. I imagined her face when she opened her own copy. That evening, the mood in the house was ice cold. My son barely spoke to either of us. She clattered dishes in the kitchen, her movements sharp and loud. I took my time with dinner, humming softly, not offering any explanation for my good mood. They were starting to see it, the truth they had been ignoring for months. I wasn't the one trapped in this house with them. They were the ones trapped with me. And I was in no hurry to let them out. The confrontation didn't happen in a burst of rage. There was no shouting, no slammed doors, no flying accusations. I'd planned it too carefully for that. By the time the day arrived, every piece of evidence was in place, every document ready. I wanted the truth to land like a heavy stone, dropped into still water. No noise at first, just the ripples spreading wider and wider, until there was no way to ignore them. It was a Sunday afternoon, the kind where the sky is heavy with clouds, and the air feels like it's holding its breath. My son was in the living room flipping through channels. She was in the kitchen scrolling on her phone. I stepped in and asked them both to join me at the dining table. My tone was calm, almost casual, but it left no room for argument. She looked at me with suspicion right away. "What is this about?" "You'll see," I said, setting down a neat stack of folders on the table. I took my seat at the head, the same spot I'd sat in for every family dinner, every holiday. But this time, there was no roast, no plates, just the quiet weight of what I was about to lay out. I opened the first folder. "This," I said, sliding the papers toward them, "is the title deed for the house. My house. As you can see, it is solely in my name, and it will stay that way." She didn't touch the papers. Her lips pressed into a thin line. My son glanced at them, but didn't speak. The next folder. "This is a record of the property restriction I filed 3 months ago. It means no sale, no transfer, no refinancing can happen without my signature in person. You've both been talking to a real estate agent. I have the receipts, the emails, even the calls you made from the backyard. All of it is here. Her eyes narrowed. You've been spying on us? I met her gaze without blinking. I've been protecting what's mine. I opened the third folder.
Bank statements transfers proof of assets moved into a trust. Everything you thought you could get from me financially, it's not yours to take. And if you try, you'll find nothing in my accounts, except enough for my monthly needs. My son shifted in his chair. Mom, we never don't. I cut in my voice, still calm, but firm enough to make him stop. Don't lie to me. Not after the months of silence, the missing money, the changes in this house that I never agreed to. She finally spoke, her tone sharper. You're twisting everything. We were trying to help you. By erasing me? I asked quietly. By deciding my future without me? Her jaw tightened, but she didn't answer. I reached for the last folder, my notebook, every entry dated, every incident noted. I slid it across the table. This is the record I've kept. It's thorough enough that if I ever needed to take this to court, I could. And believe me, I will if I have to. The silence that followed was thick. My son stared at the table. She looked at me like she was seeing me for the first time, but not in the way she wanted. You think you're clever, she said finally. No, I replied, my voice steady. I think I've been patient. Too patient. And now that's over. I stood gathering the folders into a neat pile and tucking them under my arm. You're welcome to keep living here for now. But understand this, you will treat me and this house with respect. Any step you take toward undermining me will be met with action, not words. And if you can't live with that, the door works both ways. I didn't wait for a response. I left them at the table, their faces a mixture of anger, shock, and in my son's eyes, something almost like shame. That night, the house was unnervingly quiet. No clinking dishes, no muffled arguments behind closed doors. They barely spoke to each other. I sat in my room, sipping tea, feeling the weight that had been pressing on me for months finally shift. The confrontation hadn't been loud, but it had been decisive. And now they knew the woman they thought was powerless was the one holding all the cards. I thought the house would feel lighter after that day, but it didn't, not immediately. The silence that settled in wasn't the calm after a storm. It was the kind of silence you get when everyone's watching their step, waiting to see who moves first. In the days that followed, I noticed the change in her most. She no longer strutted through the kitchen, phone in hand, talking loudly as if she owned the place. Her voice was softer, her tone more careful. But it wasn't respect, it was calculation. She was regrouping, deciding whether to push back or play along. My son avoided me almost entirely. He'd come home from work, head straight to their room, and only emerge for meals. Even then, he ate quickly, eyes fixed on his plate. I could feel the weight of his guilt, though he never admitted it. Sometimes I'd catch him glancing at me as if he wanted to say something, but then she would walk into the room and the moment would vanish. It didn't take long for the whispers to start. A friend from the community center called to say she'd heard strange stories about me, that I was paranoid, that I was making life difficult for my son, that I didn't want them to move forward. I didn't have to guess where those stories came from. I didn't defend myself. Not to her friends, not to anyone. The people who mattered would find out the truth soon enough. And besides, letting her talk gave me more time to watch. About a week later, the first real sign of fallout arrived. My cousin, the one who had heard rumors before, invited me over for tea. Halfway through, she leaned forward and said, "You know, people are starting to ask why your son's wife is in such a rush to get her hands on your house." She gave me a knowing look, the kind that says, "I don't need details, I already believe you." I hadn't planted that thought, but I knew how it had spread. Someone they'd tried to manipulate had turned on them. In small towns, that's how it works. Once the doubt is planted, it grows faster than anything you can control. Not long after, I overheard them in their room again. She was angry, saying, "We can't even show our faces without someone bringing it up." He told her to let it go for now, which was his way of admitting defeat. It wasn't just social damage. I started to notice little inconveniences creeping into their lives. A store clerk they knew well stopped greeting them with the usual warmth. A couple they often visited didn't invite them to their annual barbecue. Even her own family seemed less enthusiastic when they came by. I never said a word about it, but I could feel her eyes on me more often now, searching for signs that I was behind it all. The truth was, I didn't have to do much. Their own behavior had set the trap. I'd just refused to cushion the fall. One afternoon, my son caught me in the hallway while she was out. "Mom," he said, shifting from foot to foot, "things have been tense. Maybe we could talk just us." For a moment, I almost said yes. Almost. But then I remembered all the times I'd looked to him for support and gotten silence in return. "We can talk," I told him, "when you're ready to be honest." And I walked away. That night, they stayed in their room for hours. The muffled arguing came and went. The next morning, neither of them spoke to me before leaving the house. I could feel it happening, the distance growing between them, the pressure building. And I knew it was only a matter of time before one of them broke. When it came, I wanted to be ready. Not to hurt them further, but to make sure that when the truth came out, it left no doubt about who had really been in control all along. If Part 8 was the social unraveling, Part 9 was the legal stranglehold, the part they never saw coming until it was too late. I'd prepared for this months before the confrontation, but now it was time to tighten the grip. It began with a meeting at my lawyer's office early in the morning before the sun had fully risen. I sat across from him, my folders neatly stacked, my notes clear. "I want it airtight," I told him. "No loopholes, no back doors." He nodded, understanding, without me having to explain. First, we reinforced the trust I'd set up, making it legally impossible for my son or his wife to claim any of the assets I'd moved there. Not even my grandson's inheritance could be accessed until he turned 21, and only if certain conditions were met. Second, we registered a lien on the house in my own name. It wasn't necessary, I already owned it outright, but the extra legal layer meant that even if they tried to falsify documents, the red flags would appear instantly in any transaction. Then came the part I enjoyed most, changing my power of attorney. For years, I'd had my son listed as the one who could act on my behalf if I became ill. That morning, I signed it over to a trusted family friend. My lawyer made sure it was registered within hours. If they'd been counting on stepping into my shoes one day, that hope was gone. The ripple effects started almost immediately. A week later, I overheard her on the phone again, this time angrier than I'd ever heard her. "She's blocked everything. Even the lawyer says there's nothing to do unless she agrees." There was a pause, then a muttered, "No, she's not dying anytime soon. Believe me." It was the first time I saw fear in her voice. My son, on the other hand, seemed smaller somehow, like a man realizing he'd been standing on a ladder, with the rungs slowly disappearing beneath him. He avoided my gaze, and when he did speak, it was in short, careful sentences. The legal lock tightened further when my bank notified me that someone had tried to access my account online using incorrect security answers. I didn't need to guess who it was. The attempt triggered an automatic alert and a freeze on the account until I confirmed it was safe. I confirmed, but not before moving another portion of my funds into an account they couldn't trace. Around this time, the real estate agent stopped calling.
I imagined they'd been told to leave it alone either by my son or by her. But the damage to their confidence had been done. They no longer spoke in the kitchen in front of me. They no longer left papers out where I might see them. They'd realized finally that I was always watching. The moment that sealed it for me came one Friday evening. They were in the living room speaking in hushed tones when she said, "We should have done it faster," before she got suspicious. My son's reply was flat. "She's been suspicious for a long time. You just didn't notice." He was right. And now their window had closed. By the end of that month, they had no legal path to take anything from me, not the house, not the savings, not even the smallest piece of land. All the power they thought they'd been quietly gathering was gone, and I hadn't had to raise my voice once to do it. The strangulation wasn't loud. It was steady, methodical, and by the time they realized they couldn't breathe, it was far too late. The legal locks had cut off their hands, but now came the part that would take away their voices, the social isolation. It happened so naturally that they probably didn't even realize at first how quickly the walls were closing in. It started with small things. A neighbor they used to chat with in the driveway suddenly waved from a distance instead of coming over. The cashier at the grocery store who used to ask about my grandson barely made eye contact with them. Invitations they'd always taken for granted stopped arriving: the weekend barbecue, the church fundraiser, even a close friend's birthday dinner. I hadn't called anyone to smear their names. I didn't need to. In communities like ours, the truth doesn't need a megaphone, it just needs a seed. And they'd planted enough of those themselves with their arrogance, their little slips in conversation, their careless talk about plans for a house that wasn't theirs. I kept living my life as if nothing had changed. I went to the market, attended community center meetings, brought homemade bread to my neighbor who'd had surgery. Everywhere I went, people greeted me warmly. Sometimes they'd glance at me with that look, the one that says we've heard things, but it was a friendly look, not pity. One afternoon, I was at the community center folding programs for an upcoming charity event, when a woman leaned over and whispered, "Heard your daughter-in-law's been having a hard time? People are talking." I just smiled, neither confirming nor denying. Let them think what they wanted. The less I said, the louder their own imaginations worked. At home, I noticed her phone ringing less often. The friends she used to meet for coffee stopped coming by. My son seemed restless, spending more time away, coming home later. Sometimes they'd go out together and return in stony silence, not even glancing at me as they passed through the kitchen. The tension bled into the smallest interactions. She no longer gave me fake sweet greetings in the morning. Instead, she'd pour her coffee without a word, eyes fixed on the mug. My son started eating dinner in front of the TV instead of at the table, as if avoiding any chance of conversation with me. And yet I knew the silence wasn't about avoiding me. It was about avoiding what I represented, the failure of their plan. It all came to a head one Saturday. We were all in the living room, me with my knitting, her scrolling her phone, my son half watching a sports game, when there was a knock at the door. It was an old family friend, someone my son hadn't seen in years. He greeted me warmly, but when he turned to them, his smile thinned. "I've been hearing a lot about you two," he said, not unkindly but with enough weight in his voice to make the air shift. They mumbled something about misunderstandings and excused themselves to the kitchen. When they came back, their faces were tight, their eyes avoiding mine. That was when I realized something: they weren't just losing their social standing. They were starting to lose each other. She needed an audience to feed her pride, and now she had none. He needed allies to justify his silence, and they'd stopped taking his calls. They'd built their ambitions on the idea that the world outside these walls would always back them, and now those walls were closing in. For me, it was a strange kind of peace. I didn't gloat. I didn't rub it in. I just carried on, letting the distance between them and the rest of the world grow a little wider each day. Because isolation, once it sets in, does most of the work on its own. It was late, almost midnight, when I heard the soft knock on my bedroom door. I was sitting up in bed reading the lamp casting a warm pool of light across the quilt. For a moment, I thought I had imagined it. Then came his voice. "Mom, can we talk?" I opened the door, and there he was, my son alone. His face looked older than I remembered, like the last few months had carved something out of him.
He stepped inside without waiting for me to invite him, glancing over his shoulder toward the hallway. She wasn't with him. He stood awkwardly, hands in his pockets, eyes darting to the floor. I wanted to say I'm sorry for everything. I set my book down and leaned back against the headboard. Everything, I asked, keeping my voice calm. He swallowed hard. For not standing up for you. For letting things get this bad. There was a part of me, the part that had once believed he'd always protect me, that wanted to believe this was a turning point. But as he kept talking, I realized what this really was. "She's been under a lot of stress," he said. "Things with her family aren't great, and money's tight, and I think she took it out on you. I should have stopped it. But I need you to understand, Mom, we were just trying to figure out a way forward." I tilted my head. "A way forward for who?" He hesitated, then said, "For all of us." But the way his eyes flicked away told me the truth. This wasn't about all of us. It never had been. He sat on the edge of the bed, leaning forward, elbows on his knees. "She's scared, Mom. Scared we'll never get ahead, and we need help. Your help." There it was. The apology was just the opening act. The main performance was the same as it had always been, a request. I didn't answer right away. I studied him, the boy I'd raised, the man who now sat in front of me, caught between his loyalty to me and whatever hold she had over him. I could see the desperation in his eyes, but I could also see that it wasn't just about survival. It was about pride. "What kind of help?" I asked finally. He shifted. "Just some access to the accounts again? Or if we could, maybe think about selling." "No," I said, cutting him off. My voice wasn't loud, but it was final. He looked up sharply. "Mom, I'm not changing my mind," I told him. "Not after everything." His shoulders sagged, and for a moment I thought he might actually break, that he might confess everything, tell me the truth without trying to dress it up. But instead, he stood. "She's going to take this hard," he muttered. I met his eyes. "That's her problem." He opened his mouth to say something else, then thought better of it. Without another word, he walked out. I heard his footsteps in the hall, then the soft click of their bedroom door. I sat there for a long time after he left, the book still open on my lap. The apology had been a test, and I'd passed it not because I'd refused him, but because I'd refused the version of him that put her wants ahead of what was right. Somewhere deep down, I think he knew it too. And maybe, just maybe, that was what would haunt him long after this night. The final blow to their ambitions came faster than I expected. I didn't even have to set the pieces in motion. I'd already done that months ago, without realizing how perfectly it would all line up. It started with a business venture they'd been talking about for weeks. I never asked for details, but I heard enough from their late-night conversations to know it was some sort of can't-miss investment. They were counting on a lump sum of money to get started, and I knew exactly where they thought that money was coming from: me. They'd been so sure of it that they'd already spoken to partners, hinted to friends about big changes coming. She'd even bought a new blazer and a pair of expensive shoes, clearly for whatever role she imagined herself playing in this new chapter. But without my assets, without access to a single account, their plan was built on sand. The bank wouldn't approve a loan because their credit was already strained. The partners they'd been courting, they pulled out when no money materialized. I heard about it before they even told me. A mutual acquaintance from the community center mentioned seeing her in town on the phone looking furious. She was saying something about being stabbed in the back, the woman told me, raising her eyebrows. I only smiled. 2 days later, it exploded in the house. I was in the garden when their argument spilled out of the open windows. She was yelling, accusing him of not securing the funds and letting your mother ruin everything. He shouted back that she'd been overconfident, that she should have waited. Then I heard the words that told me exactly where they stood. "She'll never give it to us, don't you get it?" he said. "She's made sure we can't touch a thing. It's over." That night, neither of them came to dinner. I ate alone, the sound of my fork against the plate the only noise in the house. I wasn't gloating, not exactly. What I felt was closer to closure. The game they'd been playing was finished. They knew it, and I knew it. The next morning, I found her in the kitchen making coffee. She didn't look at me as she poured it into her mug. "Hope you're happy," she said flatly. "I'm at peace," I replied, and walked away. In the weeks that followed, their energy changed. She stopped talking about the future. He stopped asking me for small favors. They both kept more to themselves, moving around the house like tenants counting down the days until their lease ran out. One evening, I came home from the market to find them sitting together at the table, silent papers spread out between them. She glanced at me, then quickly looked away. I didn't need to see the details to know they were planning their exit. I didn't say a word. Let them leave on their own terms. That was better than forcing them out. They'd always told themselves they were the ones in control. Let them keep that illusion if it made it easier to walk away. Because the truth was, I'd already won, not by taking anything from them, but by making sure they couldn't take from me. They left quietly, without a dramatic scene, without the shouting or slammed doors I half expected. One morning, I came downstairs and found a stack of boxes by the front door sealed with tape. My grandson was sitting on the couch, watching cartoons, a small backpack at his feet. "We're moving into a place closer to town," my son said when he saw me. His voice was careful, almost formal. She was in the kitchen, rinsing out a mug. She didn't look up. I nodded once. "If that's what you've decided." He hesitated, maybe expecting me to ask where or why or how they could afford it. I didn't. I just walked past him and crouched down to my grandson's level. "You take care of yourself, sweetheart," I said, brushing his hair back. "And remember, Grandma loves you." He gave me a shy smile before turning back to the TV. The next hour was a blur of movement. Boxes carried out the scrape of furniture across the floor, her clipped instructions as she directed him to load the car. When they were ready to leave, my son stood by the open door, looking at me like there was something he wanted to say, but couldn't. She was already in the driver's seat, the engine running. "Goodbye, Mom," he said finally. "Goodbye?" I replied, my voice steady. And then they were gone. The sound of the car faded down the street, leaving the house in a stillness I hadn't felt in years. For a while, I just stood in the hallway, looking at the empty space where their shoes had been piled, where her coat had hung, where their presence had filled the air with tension. The silence felt different now, not heavy, not dangerous. Just mine. In the days that followed, I began putting the house back the way it had been. My photographs returned to the walls. The cushions she'd hidden in the closet came back to the sofa. I cooked what I wanted when I wanted. No one watched over my shoulder. No one corrected me. No one treated me like I was in the way. Friends began visiting more often. The neighbors lingered longer at the fence. Even my cousin from Montreal came to stay for a weekend, filling the house with laughter and stories. It reminded me of what this place had been before, a home, not a battlefield. I never heard exactly how things turned out for them. Bits and pieces reached me,
The new place was smaller than they'd hoped. The big investment never happened, and they were keeping to themselves more. I didn't chase down the details. Whatever struggles they faced now were theirs to manage. People sometimes ask if I've forgiven them. My answer is always the same. Forgiveness doesn't mean opening the door again. It means I no longer carry the weight of what they did. I've set it down, and I've moved forward. I've learned that protecting yourself isn't selfish. It's necessary, especially when the people you love mistake your kindness for a weakness they can exploit. If my story has a legacy, it's this: you can be quiet, you can be patient, but you should never be passive when it comes to your own life. I didn't win by shouting louder or fighting dirtier. I won by preparing, by waiting, and by making sure that when the time came, the choice was mine. Now, when I walk through my home, I feel the same thing in every room: safety. Not because no one will ever try to hurt me again, but because I know I will never let them.